I think the biggest thing I would say is being able to gift my daughter with what I didn't have. I'm so grateful for the mother that I did have because I was able to fill in those gaps. And it was the same for my mother. And I do believe that that is really the cycle of generational curse breaking, right? It's not this overnight thing where, this generation, we're here to acquire the wealth and the land and you know what I mean? It really starts back to a foundation. I always say that for African Americans, Black people, our enslavement was no longer physical, it was mental. So I really felt like we had to really lay a strong foundation in regards to education and enlightenment. So that was my biggest thing. And so just think, when you continue to build on those layers, I mean, my family, my parents were a direct byproduct. I mean, even still living in it, right? Like, in the 70s and 80s, they were a byproduct of the crack epidemic. It was new. It was something that everybody was doing, and it had a huge impact on our family. So, here we are, fast forward, and it's like, my mother grew up in a time where, domestic violence was very prevalent. Men were on drugs. The solution to our problems, right? The uprooting of industrialism, ridding a lot of those factory and warehouse jobs, because that was something that was encouraged to African Americans to essentially build stability for themselves. It wasn't encouraged to go to college. College was more of a thing that was a bit of a privilege, right? Obviously, access and resources were something that was not, as prevalent, right? People weren't really privy to the knowledge. And I think even still to this day, I mean, me going to college, kind of like being a first generation grad student, but first generation, there was a lot my family could not teach me. There was a lot they didn't know. There was a lot I had to struggle with. I didn't have anyone there guiding me and holding my hand. I had guidance counselors who at the time were pretty racist. I was at a PWI, so it was incredibly challenging. I completely underestimated, what it really took to obtain a college degree, and how you really needed like a lot of, it's not really just this thorough thing of like going through and through. And I think for the people who do, you may have had, experiences prior, with your secondary education, but that wasn't my experience. I kind of went to like a public school. There was some SAT prep, but there wasn't anything that was like, there was no guiding light for that transition, and I did not have that foundation. So I struggled, and so I had to go back when I was much older, and I was able to be like, I was more disciplined in my own life just from building that foundation. But it was incredibly difficult. It was not easy. It was not easy. But yeah, so, my parents were able to gift me something that looked a lot different, so back to what I was saying about domestic violence. Domestic violence was not considered illegal until 1997. So my entire family, I mean, all of my ancestors, and I say ancestors, I mean like present day, well, maybe not like ancestors. Let me just call them all of my great aunts and uncles, right? They were married. Like, there were a lot of Black marriages. That's why I say I don't think that Black marriage is a crisis as much as people make it seem. It's not a crisis. Black people are still very much marrying, and we've always kind of been married, but when you start talking about the tools needed to kind of form a healthy marriage, that was something they did not have. And so you have this normalization of abuse, right? You have drug abuse, because like I said, coming down from industrialization, right? A lot of our greats, great grandparents, great aunts and uncles migrated here to the north for better work opportunities, right? And so here you are, they're ridding these factory jobs, and the solution for Black people, again, right, is like, here, we're going to give you drugs, we're going to give you alcohol to kind of numb yourself, right? And you have to understand too, there is no community at this point, right? I mean, you have church, but church is kind of getting twisted, I don't know if that would be the infiltration of hip hop. I know people like to kind of, talk about all the ways in which hip hop can be empowering, but something happened there, where it was about the glorification of money. I think this is when you can even kind of start to see with movies and things like that. And yes, there's always been a twisting of like certain pastors, but I do think there was a bit of a rise there because, I mean, that's just a speculation, but like, why was the church breaking down? Why, what happened to the Black church that used to be this haven for us? It was no longer that. And I do believe that there had to be some type of social influence within Black culture that contributed to a bit of that shiestiness that we started to see a lot more prevalent within the Black church. So here you are, that foundation is uprooted. There's a normalization of abuse. The solution is drugs and alcohol. And so what you have is just straight chaos, right? And then you do have the infiltration of hip hop. So now you have the degrading of Black men and Black women. You have the normalization of this culture with baby mama culture. There's hypersexuality, right? We have a freaknik. We have all these different things. And so, yes, in the media, hip hop and the ghetto and things like that, it's glamorized. But when you're on the ground level, in reality, this stuff is incredibly destructive. Like when you're actually seeing people live this thing, it's incredibly destructive. It is not anything that is to be glamorized, And so, so here you are, you're sitting with all these pieces and, fast forward, you have my generation, right? My mother, the standard was upward mobility, right? I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to get my kids out of the city, right? Suburbia was a bit of a standard. Suburbia was a bit of like a symbolism of like Black excellence. You've made it, you're doing something, the schools are better, there's integration. Like it was just completely different. And I know that it was different because I was a byproduct of that, and prior to gentrification, which I would say we're living in like mass gentrification, there were better opportunities. It was better to live in suburbia and to go to those type of schools. And, the resources were better. Things were just better, and then even prior to my generation, the generation prior, or I would say like the kids who were born a few years, earlier, they did have access to better schooling, such as like public schooling, and it wasn't private, right? So they had the home economics and things like that. But if you follow through with the generations, the more and more Black people integrated to suburbia, the more the funding was withheld, taken away, and those programs were cut. So the education was no longer better education, right? It was really kind of like barely a step up from public education. So there really weren't any benefits now, right? And so now we're living in a time where education is like, it doesn't matter, right? You listen to the kids, you hear the teachers talking about the literacy problem. There's no structure, there's no reward, there's no understanding of the importance of education, right? And a lot of people are kind of debunking it in so many ways. And so it's very interesting to kind of see, like, you see the generations, right? And I think something that really alarms me in regards to these type of conversations is it's always like, back to what I was saying about the generational curse breaking, it's always this thing of generational wealth. You cannot have wealth without stability. And that stability that I'm referring to is stability of the mind, right? In order to craft something, in order to solve something, you need stability. I mean, think of it kind of like a math problem, right? Like you have to set the foundation in order to get a solution. And if you are all over the place, if 2 + 2 is not equaling 4 in your life, in your mind, in your body and your spirit, then it's going to be really hard for you to build wealth. I always like to kind of level these conversations by acknowledging geographical awareness. So let me just say that first and foremost, I live in a city that is relatively small. I think our population, well, I wouldn't say small. I mean, I think our population is about 300,000 people. But Black people here are a bit of the majority, but they're impoverished, right? And so highest education is high school diploma, GED. So there's not a lot of like post-college, college or graduate, That's not anything that's prevalent here. Median income, 30 to 40,000. right? So where I am, there's a lot of poverty. And I think I like to acknowledge geographical awareness because I do understand just from my own personal experiences from traveling, people in the South are doing a lot better, right? African Americans in the South are doing better. And I don't want to, let me not make that generalization because I don't want to just make a blanket statement because there are some people here in the North who are doing great. Like I've met, a previous mentor of mine, a guidance counselor, her husband owned a McDonald's, right? So like there are people who are doing well. So let me not say this as a matter of fact, but what I am saying is that there are a lot of Black people who are poor. And so I think it's important to kind of like acknowledge that and just recognize that this is not everybody's experience, right? Like not everybody is struggling, not every Black, and I think that is so awesome and it's so cool. And I just love that for the Black people who don't have that reality. But I do like to acknowledge geographical because I think sometimes when people hear me, you may not know where I'm from or, I have a tendency to kind of speak of like as a matter of fact, because oftentimes I am speaking from a place of truth, but I do like to provide a little bit of context when we have these conversations in regards to poverty and education, because a lot of people will rebuttal and they're like, not all Black people are poor. And I think it's important, right? Because I think we should acknowledge the stereotypes in regards to poverty. When you hear poverty, when you think poverty, you think Black. You think Black, you don't think white. I remember I was volunteering actually at a food kitchen with my ex-husband. And I remember just like being in this environment and I was honestly kind of taken back. I mean, there were so many impoverished white people, and it was out a little bit further, kind of like in the boonies. There weren't a lot of Black people out there, but just to know that like, oh, wow, that really, and I know it sounds crazy, but it's true, because I had never seen that. And so, but even still, it's interesting because white people, even though they are impoverished, they still think they're better than you, and they still feel so entitled, it's completely different. But I mean, entitlement can really go across the board, rich, poor, white, Black, but it still is that. And, racism and things like that, it always really boils down to a lack of education, whether it's a lack of exposure or just genuinely a lack of education. You don't know what you don't know. And so there's that. But yes. So generational wealth building is something that is done throughout the duration of an entire ancestral tree. Okay. What is that chart called? I want to say it starts with an H, but I want to say it starts with an O. And then I want to say it's just a tea tree chart. But, when we really do that little, I want to say it starts with a P, like, that piology, something like that. But you know what I'm trying to say. So when you do the breakdown of your tree, with your family, look at some of the psychological aspects, and understand like what this process really is going to take and what it's really going to acquire. I think sometimes too, when we look at celebrities and we obviously idolize and we admire exceptionalism, we never really get the full context. A lot of times these are people who have, a bit of that nepotism, right? And so there's that. But then these are also people who probably come a lot further. I think that there was the one, I can't think of her name, the Black woman who owns the whiskey brand. And I think her ancestors, no, it was somebody in Houston. I think I watched it on CBS or something, or CBNC. Yeah. There was a Black woman and she was just talking about like, what her family and what her father had been building. And it was like going all the way back into like, I don't think it was giving 1800s, obviously, but it was like 1940s, and it was like they were building, this construction company. And then fast forward, here she was, and she was making like 200 million. It was just something insane, but it was like an architecture firm. And I think it was in Houston, but, just to see like how long it took, to really build that thing. And I just think that when we don't have that awareness, not only are we going to forfeit the mustard seed, right? You're going to forfeit the opportunity that's in front of you, whether that's a multifamily, whether that is a business, you're going to forfeit it because you don't understand longevity and you don't understand what it really is to like have multi-generational wealth. And you also have to understand that it is not solely exclusive to materialism. wealth is knowledge. It really is. I mean, I even think about to this day, like we even talk about acquiring property and home ownership, just how much we are left out of the loop as African Americans in terms of government benefits, in terms of, all these different types of programs that could really help us in home ownership today, right? There's a lot of grants. There's a lot of, Black people who have done the work, who have foundations and, nonprofits and things like that, who could actually aid in our home buying process, but it's like there's so much knowledge that just really goes, without spoken, and it's funny because we oftentimes gatekeep the knowledge. That's the one thing that we gatekeep as Black people. We gatekeep the knowledge, and that's the thing that we need the most to really set ourselves free. And so it's interesting how we kind of do that. But yeah, I think that that's really the curse in itself. It's like, that's why I created this podcast, even though I said documenting cultures, but it's like, really educating people because, I think sometimes it's like, well, you want people to do the work. And I get that, right? Like, for example, I remember when I first wrote my book, this was back in like 2020. And I remember, someone reached out to me and they were like, oh my God, how do you do that? Like, I always wanted to be a writer. I've got a book of poems I just want to publish. And I sent like a, pretty brief message, but thorough enough. And, this person never did publish a book. Here we are, 5 years later, no book. And it did feel like a bit of a waste of my time. I've had opportunities like that. But looking back, I mean, what did I really lose in that moment? You know what I mean? Like I sent the DM, has there been times where I've sat down with people and kind of felt the same? Sure. But like, what did I lose in that moment? Okay, let's really think about it. What could I have done with my time for that 5 minutes, 15 minutes to an hour that day? You know what I mean? If it's a lifestyle, perhaps. But I mean, let's just be honest here. I think most people want to be set free. I don't think anybody would sign up for an hour of your time, every day of the month to get nowhere. You know what I mean? That even them showing up would take some type of commitment, right? So I think we have to kind of reframe how we see knowledge and how we gatekeep with one another. There was a Black man who was successful, or at least successful, depicting, right, projecting on Instagram, on TikTok, and he was just like, I feel like, he was like, we should gatekeep because people don't understand how hard it took for you to get to where you want to be. And I do think that, again, we start talking about that entitlement. We have to personally assess, and we have to kind of gauge whether or not people are entitled. I think entitlement oftentimes comes from a level of immaturity, whether that's a lack of emotional intelligence, a lack of self-awareness, right? Just somewhere along the lines, you're just a bit underdeveloped. And I don't think that that's for every Black person across the board. So I think to kind of just make the generalization like, hey, don't give knowledge away for free because people don't appreciate it, that's not fair, and that's not right. and he was the perfect example of why I believe that we struggle to get ahead and why we're not getting ahead. You know what I mean? Because people, get to a certain place and they're like, I don't want to share. And I'm not saying you have to share everything, but I just think that, what are we really talking about, right? And I think if you're not going to be someone who's generous, to be honest, I don't think you should be on the panel, right? Like, why are you the spokesperson for Black people? Why are you coming out to these conferences to speak to people about generational wealth building or Black empowerment? You see what I'm saying? Like, I think this is just a sidebar, but I think people have to kind of start to assess, the people that they bring into these spaces because they do more harm than good. You know what I mean? Like, I think if you are going to be somebody in that space, be somebody who's real and who's genuine and someone who's generous, right? If not, we don't need you here. We don't need someone else to just sit here and exploit the poor, you know what I mean? Kind of like crap on the oppressed, that's just not what we need. We don't need someone here flashing diamonds and flashing whatever, and I think that's the thing for so many of us. You talk about that psychological enslavement, that work is never done. So what you have is people who matriculate, right? And they go on and they do great things, or at least that's the way it's presented, right? Or maybe they are doing great things in business, and their ideology is one in which it's modeled right directly after white patriarchy, and so it's like they just become essentially a white person who, it just holds the keys, So I just think that that's important. I think that's important. I think it's important to acknowledge, just all the ways in which we can help, but we don't help, right? And we start talking about generational wealth building and things like that. We just have to acknowledge that, because I think it's not really until we acknowledge that we will be free, because otherwise, we're going to keep getting the same outcomes. And if that's the case, then I think that, if I were you, I would definitely question a lot of these courses. I would question the Black entrepreneurship that is on the rise, that is essentially building businesses and 6K figure incomes based on your participation, but they're not willing to give you anything, so be mindful of that. Be mindful of that. But yeah, it goes back to that psychological enslavement that we refuse to deal with, so here you are, you're in the position, but you don't want to see anybody else free, so boom, enslavement, right? So that's generational wealth to me. The weather is going crazy out here, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I don't even know if I'm going to post this audio is probably insane. But I was just having my morning coffee, and I was like, I'm going to go ahead and record something because it's been a while. I miss you guys. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I am a wannabe PhD student who really emphasizes on independent study of things like of culture. I really delve into a lot of nonfiction. That's my jam. I don't really read for fun. I like to read for educational purposes. Fiction books are pretty cool. I'm not crapping on fiction books, but it's not really my mojo. I like to do other things for fun. So welcome. Welcome. Thank you for the follows on Spotify. I've seen some bad reviews there. I wasn't able to read the reviews, but I felt like some of them might have either came from audio issues or, people may be feeling some type of way back when I was a bit more radical when I used to talk about race. That was actually interesting too, because, it was more so like learning how to articulate the tough things. I would watch other Black historians and they would articulate, matters in regards to race in such a professional and kind of like, way. And here I was, just this girl coming out talking about issues of race. And I'm like, yeah, white people, and even still to this day, I think maybe it was just a lack of confidence, but I was a bit more radical. So I don't know. I couldn't see those reviews, but if you do like this pod, go ahead and rate the podcast. I would definitely appreciate that. And I hope you guys have a great day. Peace.